Hi, so this next video is going to be putting a vinyl emblem onto this pirate ship sail, and I'm going to be doing it with vinyl. This vinyl is the kind you get at sign making shops. You can get it on the internet as well. If you're really good at cutting, you can do it by hand. If you're not, you can take your artwork to a sign making shop and they can cut it using a machine based on your line drawing. This stencil is cut. I'm going to hold it in the light in various ways so that you can see there's little cut patterns in there. And what I like to do is when you are removing vinyl, it loves to stick to itself and become a mess. This particular one is a practice one, so I'm probably going to mess it up on purpose so you can see what happens. But in the meantime, I'm going to also take an X-Acto knife and I'm going to cut my pattern up into sections. And the reason I do this is because if you're dealing with a very large stencil, by the time you're done with it, it'll probably have attached itself to itself. And what I mean by that is it gets so complex that as you're pulling it, it can easily flip over backwards and sort of attach itself to the front of your artwork. And then you have a big mess. So by cutting it into sections, it turns it into a smaller proposition where you aren't dealing with quite so many potential disasters. So here, I'm going to probably have a disaster here on purpose for you, but we'll start off without one. And then if I look like it's heading towards a disaster, I'm going to let it happen so you can see it happen. So I take my pokey tool. You can also use the end of an X-Acto knife, and I start lifting it off. And if you're doing words, be careful of those eyes and the periods and anything that's small and loose. They love to come off. So it's sometimes holding down your finger where you know there's an eye is going to be. I'm sorry that the heater just kicked on. It's cold here. Hopefully you can still hear me. Okay. And right here is a potential disaster because the E, see, fell back down. That has the potential of ruining your whole piece if it fell back the wrong way. Luckily for me, it fell back the right way. There you go. So that becomes scrap and it should be put away. Then you can weed out the centers of the words. And there you go, the word pirate. Now, if I hadn't cut right here, I'd still have this big old piece in my hand, and now I'd be working on the second word, which is the word Mickey. So it's nice to cut into sections so that you're just dealing with smaller pieces, less complex. Okay, so I've got the final. It's going to be white, and I'm about ready to put transfer tape on it. This is a low-tack tape. I like to use it for repositionability. Okay, this looks like it's just gonna be curly. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. I'm gonna go ahead and tape it down so that I don't run into trouble with it. I always bend my transfer tape in the center, so I'm just making contact in the center. Looks like I've got a forgotten piece. Yikes! If you ever have a forgotten piece like that, don't freak out. It's one of those things, once you put it onto your final material, you should be able to peel it back off. Okay, here we go. These squeegees are very, very handy. You can find them online. They don't cost very much. sign making website should have it. Okay, Once you have it done, I highly recommend trimming all sides except for the top. The top you're going to leave on so it acts like a hinge. Okay, so I got all the measurements, and because there's nothing really square about this, I just had to go with what, you know, measured out right and what looked right and so forth. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this down fairly, you know, good adhesion onto there, and it's now going to act like a hinge. See how I can fold this back and forth like so? That's the beauty of having that top piece on there like that. If I didn't have any extra at the top, I could put a piece of tape on there, but it's sure nice having it just, you know, go extend past like that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bend this back. Peel carefully. Don't assume it's going to stick to the transfer tape just because the transfer tape is nice and sticky. You can actually have a nice sticky transfer tape and still have it not touch, you know, and stick correctly if you didn't, you know, use that enough. It's not a problem. You can just lay the transfer tape back down, go back in with your squeegee, do a little bit more squeegee work. But I always recommend just going nice and slow. Looks like we have really good adhesion here. I haven't had any pieces not stick, so that was a nice clean pull there. This is your last chance. So you should have already cleaned this, but this is your last chance to get it nice and clean. Wipe it down with whatever you need to. Make sure there's no dust. And now this is how you're laying it down. You're starting at the top where your hinge is, and you're just going to work with your squeegee the art piece down. You don't have to do a heavy pass for the first one, just in case you get into trouble. Sometimes just doing a light one. Basically what you're trying to do is just lay it down without air bubbles. That's the trick. You want to make sure you do a nice amount of pressure. When you feel like you've got the pressure right, you're going to go ahead and peel back your transfer tape and take a feel, see how it looks. If it starts to pull up your vinyl, then you haven't done enough work with your squeegee. If it comes off nice and clean, then you have. In this case, so far, looks like I've done a good job. Keep an eye on all your artwork. Even if you're staring at the word pirate and you're not looking at the ear, it could be peeling up the ear when the pirate's fine, so it's always a good idea to keep an eye on your artwork all over. Very nice. Don't forget there's a little piece of tape sitting there. Okay. Now you get one last chance to look for bubbles. Go in there and do the bubble hunt. If you have any, you can work them to the edge. If they're just not workable, you can take a piercing tool and pierce, and the holes will come out. The air will release. But the good news is we're going to be glittering this, so if you have bubbles, you're not really going to see them. Okay, so there you go. Mickey Pirate. Hey, so Diza has worked her magic on the Mickey Pirate emblem here. She went ahead and did her accents on this. And at this point, you could call the project done and just leave it as is. The vinyl will stay on there. And you know, the glue that, the glitter that Dyza did would also stay on there. So you could just walk away from this. But because we kind of like to take things to the next level here, we're a little crazy that way. We're actually going to flood coat over the top of this, and it's going to make it seem like it's embedded, which it is. And it's going to be a cool look. So we're going to go ahead and clean the surface. When you want to do a second coat of a second flood coat of epoxy over the top of an existing dry one, it's really important to clean it. Now, I can see Dyza's handprints in the epoxy. I can see where she kind of leaned on it. You can see dust and so forth. These are all things that epoxy doesn't like. It wants a really nice clean surface to bond to. And if there was any dust in it, it's going to get embedded and you're going to see it. So it's really important just before you're ready to do the flood coat, like literally just before, like I've already mixed my flood coat, I'm ready to roll, I clean it. Now you wouldn't want to clean it like a half hour before because dust can fall on it. So I highly recommend cleaning it just before you're going to do your work. So this is rubbing alcohol. Basically just do a really nice clean before you get ready to roll. Take one last look at it. Now when you're looking at epoxy, it's so shiny, it's hard to see sometimes. So I always like to get a light and really get down and not look straight at it. Look at an angle. Because you can see so much more at an angle. Like right now I can see I missed a little piece of dust right there. And another one right there. Okay. Looks good. Oops, one more. See? Okay, here we go. I'm using the same technique as before. Pouring it on, spreading it around. I think I have the box right next to me so you can see the brand I'm using. There's a tip I want to share with you while I'm doing this. If when you're spreading this epoxy and you see, like let's say something that looks like the Milky Way, where it's like very, very fine white, those are gazillions of air bubbles. Now, air bubbles are something that come with epoxy. When you're stirring it, it sort of just is inherent. But when you're doing this particular type of work with epoxy, if you're seeing them, it generally means it's too thick. In which case you want to keep spreading until that cloudiness disappears. When you get to about the right thickness, that Milky Way effect actually goes away. It's just gazillions of air bubbles that are so tight together that they have a white appearance. If you get that look, you've gone and put it on way too thick. So if you see that, just keep spreading it to the edge and spreading it to the edge and spreading it to the edge until it's all gone. And when you get it to the right thickness, I promise, it goes away. Okay, time for me to get the heat gun out. Okay, so this is a tip from me to you. I learned this the hard way. I made my very first table with this stuff, and it was gorgeous. It was just gorgeous. Heat gun, popped all those little bubbles. I was like, man, I'm something else. And I never looked again. I didn't come back 15 minutes later. I just closed up the room for dust. You know, I didn't want to go in and out because of dust. So I'll just close up the room and I'll come back tomorrow. And, you know, 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it turns out you need to check it because a whole nother series of bubbles can show up. And if you wait until the next day, it's dry and you missed all those bubbles. So just take it from me. You don't want to necessarily mess with it too much, but you got to check on it at least once after you're done. That way you can make sure. Now, the second thing is do that same trick I had before where I took it down like this on an angle, and I look on an angle. Because from the top it looks, woo, it's perfect. But if you look from an angle, you can see if you're missing anything. And miraculously, I'm not. It looks great. But if you were to get down there at an angle, take a look at it, very often you'd be like, oh my goodness, there's a whole hole over here. You just can't see it from the top because it's so beautiful and dynamic. But then you come over and look over the top, you're like, oh, wow, okay, problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and put my gun away, come back in 15 minutes, shoot it again, and then I'll show it to you when it's done, okay? When you're working with epoxy and you're doing flood coats, the back side can develop these little bubbles. You can go ahead and, as it dries, you can go and keep checking on it every few minutes and knock the bubbles off. But you'll find that even with all your efforts, it'll creep a little bit. These can just be sanded down or use a Dremel tool or sand them. Right here. They come right off. But it's something to keep in mind with epoxy. You will get, a little bit of edge work that you'll have to do. I find that with a belt sander or a disc sander or a Dremel tool, they come off very easily. Then you can, touch up your paint again if you need to, if your backside is going to be seen. But that is something to keep in mind when you're doing flood coats of epoxy. But it's so worth it. Look at that.